Hey everyone, welcome back to the Tailwardens YouTube channel. My name is Kunal and I am one of the maintainers of the Komiser project. In this particular video, we are going to learn how you can deploy Komiser onto an EKS cluster such that you can monitor the resources from two different AWS accounts. Now, if you have been following the channel for a while, you would know that we already have a video where Jake has actually showed you how you can deploy Komiser onto an EKS cluster, and there we actually see how you can monitor the resources of a single AWS account. In this particular video, we are going to take that up a notch and we are going to monitor the resources from two different AWS accounts. I'm pretty excited and let's get right into it. Alrighty, so as a very first step, you'll need to create an EKS cluster in your admin's AWS account. So here you can see that I have logged in into my admin user account and I've already created an EKS cluster named Komiser cluster. Now once you have created a cluster, you can access it using kubectl. So if I do kubectl get nodes, as you can see, it's a simple 2 nodes cluster up and running. And later on, once we have configured all the IAM permissions, we'll actually be using a Helm chart, which I'll just show you in a moment, to deploy Komiser onto this particular cluster, right? Now, if you have multiple Kubernetes clusters running in your system, you can use a tool like kubectx to quickly switch between context of these clusters. So as you can see, I have a total of 4 clusters running, but right now I am in the admins cluster, right? So my current context is in the admins cluster. Cool. So you can use a tool such as kubectx, or you can always use the good old kubectl config get context command to basically switch between different clusters. So now that we have our EKS cluster up and running, let's see what configurations do we need in our admin as well as the dev account. Now, in order to authenticate our EKS cluster with the admin as well as the dev account, we'll be creating an IAM OIDC provider for our EKS cluster. You can definitely find the steps to create an IAM OIDC provider in the Komiser documentation. So head over to docs.komiser.io and under the AWS section, you can find all the steps using which you can create a new OIDC provider for your cluster. And I have already gone ahead and created a new identity provider for my EKS cluster. Now, as Komiser is deployed on our EKS cluster, which is in the admin's account, we would definitely need to authenticate our EKS cluster with the dev account as well, right? We are also going to create an identity provider in our dev account using the same OpenID Connect provider URL from the EKS cluster. So as you can see here, this is my dev account. I've logged in into the AWS Management Console, and here I have created another identity provider, and this is for our dev account. So now our EKS cluster is authenticated with the admin account as well as the dev account. Now the next thing that we'll be configuring are the IAM roles for the admin as well as the dev account. So go ahead and create a new IAM role for the admin account, and there you'll want to attach the Komiser policy, which you can find in the Komiser GitHub repo. Here are all the permissions that Komiser actually needs to function properly. And the second thing we are going to create is a trust relationship between the cluster service account and our admin IAM role, right? So for that purpose, we are actually using the ARN ID of our identity provider that we just created right now. And also we'll provide it with the namespace name. So if you want your AWS account to be authenticated with a specific namespace, you can definitely mention the name of the namespace here. For simplicity purpose, I have just kept it as default. Basically, this means that the default namespace in our EKS cluster is actually authenticated with our admin AWS account. All right. So these are the two configurations that we need to do in our admin IAM role. There's one thing that's still left, and we'll revisit it after we have created the dev IAM role. So if we go ahead in our dev account, here I've already created an IAM role, which is called as Komiser dev. And here as well, we are using the same Komiser policy that I just showed you, which you can find in the Komiser GitHub repo, and I'll also link in the description box down below as well. Now here, we are actually creating a trust relationship between the admin accounts IAM role and the dev accounts IAM role, right? So you can definitely see how these two things will be connected and how Komiser, which is deployed on the EKS cluster, will be able to fetch resources from both these accounts, right? So go ahead and create this particular trust relationship and give the ARN ID of the Komiser admin role that we just created. So these are the only two things that we need to configure for our dev IAM role. Now that we have configured our IAM role for the dev account, we just have to make a small change in the IAM user of our admin account. We'll just modify our Komiser policy with the assumed role statement right here. So here we are actually establishing a two-way relationship between the resources in our admin's account and the resources in our dev's account, right? So go ahead and modify the policy of your admin's IAM role. And now we've successfully configured our dev account and the admin's account. In order for us to deploy Komiser onto the EKS cluster, we are going to use a Helm chart, which you can find on the GitHub repo right here, and I'll also link it down in the description box. But what we are going to do is we'll actually be modifying this Helm chart to fit our particular use case, right? So go ahead and clone this particular Helm repo onto your system, and let's see what changes we have to make here. So if we quickly explore the files in the chart, in the values.yaml file, you'll find the tag value here, which is stating the latest release of Komiser, which is 3.1.2. If you're watching this video in the future, you can go ahead and change the value of this tag to the latest Komiser version. Now, if you have a default region for your AWS account, you can go ahead and set that value right here. Now, the important folder that we'll want to configure is the templates folder and all the files under that, right? So the very first one is we are actually creating a config map, and that's how we are actually feeding the .toml file to Komiser, which Komiser will actually use to authenticate to our AWS accounts. So here, as you can see, we are using two different accounts. So number one is the admin's account and number two is the dev account. And for the credentials for that, I am providing it using the credentials file. If you're using environment variables, you can go ahead and change the source to environment variables, and make sure you have configured the environment variables for both the accounts, that is the admin's account as well as the dev account. For storing Komiser's data, we are actually using the default SQLite file, and in Kubernetes we have created a persistent volume. So here we have a persistent volume, and to attach this to a particular pod, we are actually using persistent volume claim, which is right here. Now this is the service account that we have created for Komiser, and this is the part where you'll have to input the ARN ID of the admin's IAM role, right, where the cluster is actually running. Service.yaml file, and that's how we'll be able to access the Komiser dashboard. So here we are using a node port type of service, which is listening on port 80, and it's actually be exposing port 3000 on which Komiser is actually running. And the last file that we have is the deployments manifest, and that is how we are actually creating the pods for Komiser. Now, if you are using this for testing purposes, make sure you don't change the volume mounts values, especially the paths here, right? And if you are using this for production purposes, you can definitely change it according to what fits in your use case. And that is basically the whole Helm chart configuration looks like. Pretty simple one. The main part in this entire tutorial, in my opinion, was to configure the permissions for our dev and the admin's account, and that we have already done. So now it's time to use this Helm chart and deploy Komiser onto our EKS cluster. The command is as simple as helm install Komiser, and we'll use all the files in this current directory. Now the Helm chart has been successfully deployed. If we do kubectl get pods, you see that Komiser pod is up and running, and this is basically in the default namespace, right? And if we do kubectl get service, so you can see the node port type of service is also up and running. Now, in order to access your Komiser dashboard, there are two things that you can do. Number one is you can configure an elastic load balancer, which you can then attach it to your service, and that's how you'll be able to access your dashboard using that external elastic load balancer link. The second method that we'll be using right now is port forwarding, right? So go ahead and do kubectl port forward, the name of the service, which is Komiser service, and then we'll port forward the traffic from our node port to the port 80, which is the service port. Now once this is running, this is actually forwarding all the external traffic from our node port to port 3000, which is where Komiser is actually running. So if we now go ahead and go to localhost port 30758, you'll be able to access your Komiser dashboard. And one very interesting thing to note here is that Komiser has already identified that two different cloud accounts have been created here. So it has mentioned in cloud accounts the number is 2, and you can also group the resource manager by cloud account. So if you go ahead, there you can find both the cloud accounts, the dev as well as the admin accounts resources are being monitored by Komiser. Pretty interesting, right? Already, I hope you were able to follow along with me and was able to deploy Komiser onto your EKS cluster. If you got stuck anywhere or if you have any doubts, feel free to comment that down below, or you can always join our Discord community at Tailwarden, and you can always ask your doubts there as well. We'll be happy to help you there. And also I'll be providing the links for all the resources and GitHub repositories that I used in this particular video in this description box down below, so you can readily access those. Plus you'll also find the link for the blog post with a bit more detailed steps as compared to this particular tutorial, and that also would help you in clearing any doubts or any issues that you would face. Lastly, I really hope that you learned something new from this particular tutorial. Feel free to join our Discord community if you want to get involved with Komiser, and if you want to contribute, we are always open for new contributors to get involved. Yeah, that's it for today, and see you in the next one.